My name is Colin Grant, and I've written 5 books, and I have a commission for 2 others, which I'm very happy about. The 5 books have all been non-fiction books, and in a way they've been a surprise to me because I dreamed I'd be a novelist when I first started to write 30 odd years ago. But when I first started to write, I'd sent out a proposal to an agent called Giles Gordon, whom I admired, and he was working up in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And I remember he wrote back very quickly to say that he was not interested in ethnic writing. I was quite surprised and disappointed by that. And a few years went by with other rejections. I suppose one of the things that happens to all writers is that they accumulate many, many rejections before they get the big yes. And the big yes for me came in 2005 when I received a commission from Jonathan Cape to publish and to write a book on Marcus Garvey. So that was a real highlight for me. I remember taking the book to my mum when it was published 3 years later, and she held the book in her hand like it was the Bible, and she said, "This is history. This is history." It was a history of Marcus Messiah Garvey, but also she was saying this is history because nobody in our family had ever written a book. This is a real milestone for the family, and she wanted to mark it, and she wanted me to remember this day. I remember it till today. Subsequent to that, I thought I'd be able to persuade my publishers to allow me to write a memoir. I wanted to write a memoir about growing up in Luton in the 1960s to be called Bad Guy at the Wheel. But I went in and it was kind of clear to me that they thought that no one at this point would be interested in my story of my father and my mother growing up in Luton because I wasn't known. So I had to put that to one side whilst I wrote another book on the whalers. And then finally I wrote the book which I most love, actually, Bad Guy at the Wheel, about growing up with West Indian parents in Luton. Just 1 year, 1972. And subsequently to that, I've decided to settle down and to accept that I'm a non-fiction writer. Subsequent to Bad Guy at the Wheel, I wrote A Smell of Burning, which is about epilepsy and my brother who had epilepsy. And my last book was called Homecoming, which is an oral history of Caribbean migration. And I've taken to this notion of oral history for my next project, or my subsequent project to the next one, which is going to be an oral history of migration to Britain generally. And one of the things I want to do is to capture the actual words and the flavours of the time through the voices and the remembrances of the people who will recall arriving in England, finding their way and settling here, in the same way that the storyline of Homecoming is similarly a story of departure, arrival and settling. All these stories about migration, I suppose, have the big question about whether you will stick and stay, whether you will, in a way, forget or put to one side your past and start a new life, assemble a new life here in the UK, or whether you will yearn continually to return to the homeland where you were born. So I'm very much looking forward to that book, which will be a book where I travel around the country, throughout the country, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. So I'm really looking forward to that book, and in a way I hope it to be the culmination of everything that I've learned as a writer. But I would be remiss if I didn't praise Speaking Volumes, who have been great to me and been great to many writers in not only furthering their careers, but also supporting them, nurturing them, reassuring them that they are writers, that they can write and that they will find a readership for their work. And so I was very delighted to be included in Not Quite Right for Us, because I realised that I am quite right for Speaking Volumes. So hats off to them, and here's to the future. The BBC, as a bastion of British culture, maintains and promotes an ennobling idea of public service broadcasting that stretches beyond these shores. My invitation to join the corporation in 1991 marked a milestone for our family. It meant that we'd breached a forbidding fortress which, in the past, we'd only ever been able to stare at in wonderment. You could never have contemplated traversing the invisible moat or cordon sanitaire designed to keep the likes of us most definitely on the outside. It wasn't just that the BBC was, in the parlance of psychologists, a white space. Back then we just called it a white people ting. It is also a compromised and compromising space. In order to get into it, you'd have to consider the possibility of debasing yourself by entering a world which, as well as soberly, conscientiously and impartially broadcasting world news, also entertained viewers on Saturday nights with the Black and White Minstrel Show, featuring white men with shoe-polished black faces and bowler hats, dancing with long-legged white women. This really happened on prime-time television all the way up to 1978. A dozen years later, I was among the recruits to the BBC's World Service at Bush House, passing through the portico bearing the inscription, "To the Friendship of English-Speaking Peoples." First, we were given a tour of the magnificent neoclassical building, and then ushered into a room and sat down for the talk. A rite of passage where you submitted to the notion that, as an ambassador for the BBC, you'd never ever bring the corporation into disrepute. And you'd also religiously adhere to the mantra, accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. The BBC High Command clearly admitted without any discomfort that, as the World Service was funded by the Foreign Office, the corporation was a clever tool in the country's soft power strategy. Britain's governments, whomever they were led by, took vicarious pleasure in the BBC and were rewarded in unquantifiable ways for their association with it. Mentioning the World Service abroad in the 1990s gave you smooth entry into the lives of others. It appeared to be a kind of lingua franca or password. But growing up in a West Indian household in Luton in the 1960s, I'd never heard of it. The first time I became aware of the World Service's existence was in a Guardian advert for the radio traineeship I applied for in 1989. The advert suggested that the World Service required more employees of colour in its editorial departments, at least. This was underlined by a little black and white sketch that showed two people, a man in a kente cloth outfit and a woman in a sari, sat opposite each other at a round desk with a globe in the middle of it, giving off flashes of radio waves. Notwithstanding the cartoon's clumsiness, I was impressed by the corporation's realization that its whiteness implied that the BBC World Service was stuck in some not too distant imperial past. I was glad to meet with their approval at the interview and accepted the invitation to join. Since that invitation from the BBC, I have received 5 others, the last one encouraging me to take the golden handshake of redundancy and leave through the very doors I came in by. The other 4 invitations were not so attractive. 2 years ago, I left the BBC like a prisoner on a life sentence who had done his time without parole at a maximum security detention centre. That sounds melodramatic, I know. There was no gangster's mole waiting for me on the outside with the engine of a Bentley running, but I did have an overwhelming sense of freedom. During my 25-year career at the BBC, I topped the charts for being the employee with the highest number of disciplinary hearings in the corporation's history. One hearing, you might think, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, might be regarded as a misfortune, but 4 smacks of carelessness. The disciplinary hearing process and protocols were rather quaint. A booklet outlining what to expect now that I'd been identified as a suspect accompanied a letter that began, "Dear Colin, I'm inviting you to a disciplinary hearing." The use of the word invite seemed ironic, for this was not an invitation you could refuse.
Hi, so I'm Jethro Soutar. I'm a writer and a translator, maybe more of a translator. I would say I translate Spanish and Portuguese, and mostly literature, and mostly, at least in recent years, have specialised somewhat in African literature. Started out writing non-fiction, and in a way that's how I ended up being a translator. I'd moved to Brazil to try and sort of make my way, and ended up writing a biography of Ronaldinho, the footballer. I went around interviewing former players, teammates of his, coaches, some family members, friends, and sort of recorded the interviews I did with them, and then went home to transcribe them, and obviously translating them in the process. And I really enjoyed that, and it was a challenge that I sort of eventually led me into translating, because I realised it was a good way of combining my skills. And if you think about translating, is not just finding the meaning of a word in a different language; it's conveying style and mood and so many other things, and that's very apparent when it's somebody speaking. An interview, it's very much about their personality, and I think that's how I got into translation. Translation, I have to say, it is my job, and a job I enjoy doing. Since there's also an activism side, because it's not easy to get books published in English, translated. But it's important. It's important that we read widely, that we get to know not just different environments, different countries, the way the way life might be, stories there, but also different forms of storytelling. I'm from Sheffield, but I lived, as I said, in Brazil, also in Barcelona, and then now in Portugal. I'm now in Setúbal, writing and translating, working on a novel, but I have been for 10 years, so don't hold your breath. Have you ever been in a fist fight? Not your usual first question in a job interview, but then most job interviews don't start with the Lucia colour test. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I remember sitting there staring at the coloured cards: red, green, yellow, blue, purple, brown, grey, black, and wondering what on earth I was expected to do. Put them in order, I'd been told. What sort of order? I asked. Whatever order seems right, the man from recruitment said. You mean like a rainbow? If that's how you want to do it, he said. This was London in 2000s. I'd been living abroad and had just moved back to the UK and needed a job. After applying for several, this was the only reply I'd got. It was for a researcher position at a company operating in the legal sector, starting salary 18 grand. There'd been no mention of a good eye for colour in the job description. A few minutes passed. Aware that I ought to show some initiative, I took a deep breath and rearranged the cards in a sort of progressive order, more of a paint chart than a rainbow. The man from recruitment wrote down my selection and left the room. I'd just taken Max Lucia's personality test. A Swiss psychotherapist, he developed the test in the late 1940s based on the premise that colour preferences are guided by the unconscious and reveal deep personality traits. Blue, yellow, red and green are considered the basic colours, and placing them early in the sequence indicates a well-balanced individual. Purple, brown, grey and black are the auxiliary colours. Favouring them implies a negative attitude to life. I can't remember what order I chose, but it was evidently sufficient to pass myself off as stable and positive. When the recruitment man came back, he told me to go upstairs and meet the boss. Now, the boss was a man in his 60s, who I'll call CM. He owned the company and it bore his name. Indeed, it still does, though it's under new management. His office was a small study with a large desk and leather-bound books crammed on shelves. I went in and sat down, and he pretended not to notice me. 2 or 3 minutes went by. I wondered if I should say something, whether this might not be another test of initiative. But it was a bit late for that. I'd set out my stall as polite and patient, and it was probably better to stick to it. After perhaps 10 minutes, he feigned sudden awareness of my presence. He fumbled around for a piece of paper, presumably my CV, and overacted the reading of it, making pained and astonished facial expressions. Then he asked, "Have you ever been in a fist fight?" Actually, that wasn't the question he asked me. I heard that from someone else later. My question was tame in comparison. Why is there so little realism in Latin American literature? This might make some sense as a question to ask me now. I'm a literary translator and I've translated novels from Brazil and Argentina, but I hadn't done anything like that at the time. My CV would have mentioned that I'd written about South American football and cinema, and this, presumably, was enough of a cue. I was surprised by the question, but it also put me at ease. The strangeness of the day began to make sense. He was trying to unsettle me to see how I'd react. Fine. I'd been to university. I knew the game. I told him that actually there was plenty of realism in Latin American literature. It was just that magic realism had become popular internationally. We had a bit of back and forth about it. I defended my argument and got the job. At the end of my first week, I went to the pub with my new colleagues. "So what random question did the old bugger ask you?" someone said. It turned out that all candidates were pretty much treated to the same routine. We went around the table comparing opening gambits. "Do you play a musical instrument? Have you ever swallowed a spider? Alfred Hitchcock was a terrible hack, wasn't he? Can you explain the Israel-Palestine conflict to me? Do you believe in sex before marriage? Spanish is a very limited language, wouldn't you say? 27, is that young or old? Have you ever been in a fist fight?" A French colleague was asked, "Have you ever robbed a bank?" Which sounds amusing, and indeed he laughs about it now. But at the time, as a young man attending a first job interview in a foreign country and a different language, he found it so disconcerting he'd rung his mum afterwards to tell her he was moving back to France. He couldn't believe it when he got the job. Having no cultural reference could also be an advantage. A Lithuanian colleague was asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" This being her first job interview in the UK, she assumed it was just standard procedure rather than intrusive and inappropriate, and answered matter-of-factly, "Next question." How you respond to strange questions also depends on your idea of strange. When I asked another friend about her interview, she said, "Oh, mine wasn't weird at all. We just discussed trends in postmodern art theory." Not everyone was asked a question. I heard of someone who was told to do a dance. Another was led around a nearby gallery, while another was taken for a walk. The office was near Smithfield Market, an old area of London full of cut-throughs and alleyways. And midway through the walk, indeed mid-conversation, CM disappeared. My future workmate stood around for a while, then went home. He too was astonished to get the job. A Brazilian friend swears she was hired only because she mentioned in passing that she'd once lived on a canal barge. The interview had been a disaster up until then. And a Cuban friend has no doubt that he got the job because he was Cuban. The interview went on for over an hour and consisted entirely of questions about life in Cuba. He wasn't even asked to do the written English test usually required of non-native speakers. CM's love of Cuba was well known among staff. One colleague shared this fact with a friend who was coming in for an interview. The friend had been to Cuba earlier in the year. "I understand you like Cuba," he said, cracking under the strain of the silent treatment. "I was there recently." CM looked up from whatever he was pretending to do and said, "Tell me about the Cuban Missile Crisis." "Well, friend stuttered. "It was only a quick visit. I didn't pick up on much of the history." "You don't know anything about the Cuban Missile Crisis?" "Not as such. I mean, it was just a holiday, really." "Get out." "Sorry?" "Get out. The interview's over." "But if you've been somewhere and showed so little interest in its history and you can't tell me the first thing about it, then we've no need for you here. Goodbye." Harsh, certainly, but unfair. Most of us could see a twisted kind of logic to what happened. There was even a general sense of bemused admiration for the recruitment process among staff. Of course there was. We'd all passed the test, so it was nice to think it was uniquely demanding, that only mavericks need apply. Plus, it did seem to work. For an office of over 100 people, There were very few slackers or egos. There was also a genuine sense of community, the best I've ever known in a workplace. I made several friends while I was there. Could this really have been the product of a quirky interview and a new age personality test? The rumour in the office was that you got to the second stage of the interview provided that you didn't pick black first in the colour test. Black is deemed to be the worst of the auxiliary colours, representing a negation and nothingness. But there seemed to be more to the company's use of the test than that. A Colombian colleague spoke of going upstairs to find CM practically salivating over his colour score. Very good colours, very, very good colours. He got the job and was promoted as soon as an opening came up. He was good at the job and eminently qualified to do it. No wonder he got promoted. But promotion meant moving up the pyramid and climbing into closer contact with the boss. One Monday morning, he was summoned to CM's office. "It's about the new guy," CM said. "We've made a terrible mistake." CM had interviewed a young Brazilian man the previous week, and my Colombian friend had called him on the Friday to tell him he got the job. "What do you mean a mistake?" "His father's a baker." "Right, and a baker's son. How could I be so stupid? I haven't been able to sleep all weekend." "Not sure You'll have to call him back," said CM. "Tell him he's not right for us after all." Whether this was simple class prejudice or something more hocus pocus, we'll never know. CM rushed off, meeting over, leaving my friend to traipse back upstairs and make the fateful phone call. He did it. Then he sat at his desk and thought about the job and the company and the man he worked for. He handed in his notice the next week.
This middle place, a hinterland neither here nor there, is somewhere I am familiar with. It is often how I've described my feeling about class and my position in society. Floating between two identities but claimed by neither, rootless and placeless. Of course, I have written widely about background, class and poverty. I wrote a whole book about returning to the working class communities I grew up in. Last year, I travelled the length and breadth of the country and spoke to over 100 audiences, from the London Palladium to the University of St Andrews, about class and poverty. I talked on radio and TV. I wrote articles and essays. Each time I approached these topics from what I thought was an inarguable standpoint. This was my life growing up working class. This is the impact it had on me as an adult. This is what we might be able to do to lessen the damage of poverty. One of the many things I learned during this time is that people are very nervous about the filthy C word. That's class, by the way. I can't imagine what you were thinking of. At each juncture, my inarguable standpoint of self-identification and lived experience seemed, well, arguable to many. How, I was asked, could I still call myself working class if I was sitting on stage or writing in a newspaper? Wasn't my childhood simply chaotic and deprived? Didn't I grow up with a parent who was struggling while living in care homes and B&Bs? That's not working class, they told me. That's individual dysfunction. The ones who didn't understand how little writers make asked if I wasn't too financially comfortable now to call myself working class. Others felt that even if I did earn the same as a manager in a small shop, my cultural capital made me undeserving. Still, others wish me to bestow upon them somehow a seal of approval, or to validate them, a crib sheet for working classness. My parents were comfortable, they said, insert a middle class profession of your choice here, but brought me up with working class principles. Am I working class? Who gets to decide if I'm working class or not? Spoiler, it isn't me. If you make your living doing something as luxurious or self-indulgent as art, and please note my added sarcasm here, can you be working class? Is it insulting to be called working class? Is it virtue signaling to make the claim? Does the working class even exist anymore? As straitjacketed as Britain is, it seems it is not as binary as many might hope. Ultimately, these roles have always been variable and become ever more so as our society, workforce, and access to income, welfare, education, and social mobility morph with each decade and change in government policy. I admit I have exploited these ambiguities in defining myself in the past. When given very little option, if I was to move through worlds that were not my own, say, or when I had to learn the language and customs quickly or be banished. I did it at university, carving away my sharp council estate edges and a lot of my personality to try to fit in with the public school Mirandas. I did it again at 23, starting out in a job with an NGO at the top of a shiny skyscraper by the Thames, not knowing how to add an attachment to an email, but knowing well enough that I should never mention where I came from, the benefits queues or care homes. I did it at 32 at impressive parties, standing in gilded rooms drinking white wine, smiling sweetly while people who own 2 houses asked me archly, "Where is that accent from?" And stayed silent while they tried to sort me into a hierarchy they could feel comfortable with. I've done it even just shy of 40. A best-selling and prize-winning author, listening to a radio producer saying that despite my upbringing, I must, quote, read and write well enough, at least. I have travelled everywhere within this hinterland and felt neither here nor there. But what has saved me, what has allowed me to navigate a society that desperately wanted to categorize and catalog me, denying me agency to do so myself, is that I have identified as working class my whole life. Not always for others' benefit, but within myself, in my bones and marrow. I learned that it's not a place after all. It's a foundation, something solid upon which to stand. I have always felt part of the rich culture of people who keep society turning, who keep living tenaciously, even though the lives of better off folk are stacked on their shoulders. When I meet someone who also grew up on council estates, even knowing that all council estates are not equal, I feel a sense of kinship. Do you know what it's like to wait hungrily for the benefits book to be cashed for payday to come around? Was it not simply assumed that you'd learn to drive or go to university or eventually have a mortgage? Then yes, you're part of my tribe, large and diverse though it is. If you are like me, you've also experienced meeting someone and feeling that shared understanding of background, culture, and challenges faced daily. It's both comforting and empowering to connect with someone who simply recognizes you, though you've never met before. No, it's not just that I grew up poor, which after all focuses only on the economics, when in fact inequality in our society, where we find ourselves in that hierarchy, affects everything: life expectancy, educational attainment, likelihood of mental illness. Last year, in the face of so many questions from audiences, I began to ask myself, in whose interest is it to dismantle the working class by protesting that it doesn't exist anymore? Who benefits from the erasure and silences of the many of us who would publicly call ourselves working class teachers, artists, binmen, bankers, social workers, cashiers, writers, nurses, and solicitors. It is not the people who seek to give greater voice to those besieged in a country where every government policy seems designed to accelerate the decline of poorer communities. It's not those who understand that being working class doesn't just mean poor or on the dole or struggling with a 0 hours contract, but that it is a psychology and a legacy, both good and hard, all of its own. I no longer apologise for the fact that I defy checklists of stereotypes. In fact, I no longer entertain this line of questioning at all, which is designed to make the other people feel more secure by knocking me from my solid ground. No one gets to define me, even if they think they're entitled to. And by the way, why would they think that in the first place? I came to understand why for many it is difficult to accept that the working class contains multitude. Because in that solidarity lies the real power. So I will exist in this in-between place forever. But I get to choose where I focus my work, where I find my foundations. This middle place is exactly where I am meant to be. These margins are where our voices are expected to become quiet, where we're meant to become small, so we might squeeze into one permitted space or another. I am not small, and I am not quiet, and I know I am where I need to be, and I'm right, exactly as I am.
Hello, my name is Johny Pitts. I'm a writer and photographer. I've been doing many things over the past decade. Writing is at the forefront of that, and photography. And recently I've become the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Open Book, which is kind of a dream job. I just get given books, get to read them and then interview the authors. I wrote a book called Afropean Notes from Black Europe, which actually is really born from my discussions with Sharmila Bismahoon and some of the people at Speaking Volumes and the writers that surround Speaking Volumes. So it's not just Nicholas Chapman and Sarah Sanders who also form Speaking Volumes, but also people like Colin Grant, Diran Adebayo, Gabriel Gadamosi, Jay Bernard. These are people who were kind of built up by Speaking Volumes. Oh, and Bernardine Evaristo as well. They put us all together in a single room, and they took us on tour. And I learnt so much from that group of writers, and it was really the making of me. I would say it's only really recently that I feel like I'm getting taken seriously. It's been a really long, hard battle, but finally I feel like, I might be a bit more grizzled now than I used to be, but I finally feel that now I've built up a kind of platform and I'm able to do the kind of work that I always wanted to do. And it makes me think of something that, like, one of my mentors, Carol Phillips, said about Linton Kwesi Johnson, who wrote the introduction for this anthology. And he said that what's really interesting about Linton is that nobody owns him. And I've been thinking about that a lot, and thinking about how, it's great to get commissioned by these official spaces and to get jobs by these spaces. But now we're in an era where we can really build our own platforms, and work on it and do the work that we believe in and find our own audience. In 2019, my book Afropean Notes from Black Europe was published by Penguin. Though it was broadly well received, a few disgruntled commentators aired grievances as there was some new hipster on the scene who had burst out of nowhere and claimed all the glory for the hard work they had secretly been doing behind the scenes for years. So secret, in fact, that it was usually people I'd never heard of who hadn't actually been very active. If someone has anointed a black intellectual, wrote Henry Louis Gates Jr., be assured that others are busily constructing his tumbril. I was prepared for this because I'd been guilty of unwarranted misgivings about other younger writers being published when I wasn't. Communities that don't get their fair share of the spotlight can go two ways when appraising their own: supreme pride or vengeful resentment. And with good reason, there's a modicum of truth in the idea that there's only enough space for a few key black success stories in a white media landscape. Every time another black writer gets published, it can feel as though you've been robbed of your portion of an already finite availability of resources. My journey to an audience for Afropean, however, was hard won, taking the best part of 15 years and leaving me in debt because I'd had to self-finance the bulk of my travel and research before anyone would take a chance on me. I'd floated the idea around in various capacities to officialdom, a late night music show for instance, playing French hip-hop, German reggae, Swedish soul and so on, when I had a short stint at BBC Radio 1 Extra. I wanted to play Youssou N'Dour or Stromae. They wanted me to talk about what Beyonce wore to the Grammys. I pitched the idea of a trip around Europe meeting with black communities to one publisher who told me it's already been done, referring to Carol Phillips's The European Tribe, written around the time I was born. The publisher suggesting blackness in Europe was monolithic, that it hadn't shifted after 3 decades in which the geopolitical structure of the continent had been radically transformed. I wrote a treatment for a documentary and offered it to various channels who all told me it was too niche, a common refrain that usually meant too black. This was often said in that oblivious way white, middle-class men who don't consider themselves capable of racism say, "Mate, why are you going on about being black? You're British. Race doesn't matter." By contrast, a producer told a friend of mine after a screen test to present a TV show that he'd given a great audition but that, unfortunately, they already had their black presenter. Similarly, when I was whittled down to the final 2 to co-present Blue Peter with Iowa Kinwalere, one of my best friends since my childhood years, I knocked the screen test out of the park, but they chose a white presenter with much less experience who was sacked little over a year later because of his ineptness and told me I was too similar to Ayo. I'm working class from Sheffield. Aya is upper middle class Nigerian. Clearly there was only enough space for any one black person at a time. So being black doesn't make a difference anymore. I'm British. Race doesn't matter. Closest I came to getting anything like Afropean off the ground was when a production company expressed interest. After an initial period of excitement, they sent back a bastardised treatment of my idea with a new title, The Boy with No Race, A Search for Belonging. Telling the story of black Europeans wasn't enough. The documentary had to have a narrative arc, be transfigured into a patronising journey of discovery for white viewers to understand so that it wasn't too niche. I've sold out many times in this media industry to pay the bills, but thankfully this wasn't one of those occasions. I was not a boy with no race. I was a black creative with no place, kept at bay by a media industry and a country with no race, which is to say that Britain in the noughties believed itself to be post-racial. During that time I came up against endless glass ceilings only to bump my head and fall back into reductive or redundant bit parts. I was never offered a contract lasting longer than 6 months, and even when I'd held certain roles for years, they were kept on precarious rolling contracts which don't allow you to plan for anything. Worse, back then even I didn't really believe that the walls I kept coming up against were connected to racism. It was inconceivable to me that my ideas might not have been taken seriously because systematic racism was at work. Looking back, even if this notion did ever cross my mind, I probably sensed it would have been unhelpful to admit it. Creative industries are about relationships, and how could you ever prove such a thing? In the course of bringing a project to light, everybody, regardless of race, will endure setbacks, and sometimes for good reason. I was too young at the age of 20 to grapple with some of the questions I wanted to explore about black European identity. I needed to hone my craft, put in my hours, serve my apprenticeship. Afropean found its final form when it needed to. Yet during the course of my career, I'd seen others breeze through doors I had to fight to enter. They were allowed to fail and learn on the job, while I had to do things outside the job in a constant state of precarity. Everything that went into my book was forged during self-funded hours outside the random array of remunerated work to keep myself afloat. As the late cultural theorist Mark Fisher wrote of neoliberal Britain in the 21st century, if you want to engage in a 20-year-long research project funded by the state, you'll have to kill someone. This is particularly true if you have brown skin. I knew I wasn't cut out for prison, so the killing had to be figurative, and the person who needed to be killed was post-racial me. See, I'm from a generation of 80s babies, technically millennial, but old enough to remember the 20th century, and become nostalgic about the 90s and noughties as the era of fusion and multiculturalism, erring towards the post-racial, a bold, forward-looking Britain with Blair at the helm. But as Svetlana Boym wrote in her opus, The Future of Nostalgia, nostalgia, from nostos, return home, and algia, longing, is a longing for a home that no longer exists or has never existed. Nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it's also a romance with one's own fantasy. Nostalgic love can only survive in a long-distance relationship. A cinematic image of nostalgia is a double exposure or a superimposition of two images, of home and abroad, past and present, dream and everyday life. The moment we try to force it into a single image, it breaks the frame or burns the surface. Only in the writing of this piece have I recognised acutely just how awful the decade in which my generation came of age, the 2000s, actually was in terms of representation. The obliviousness in Britain back then seems hard to believe now. Books such as the Idler Book of Crap Towns by writers educated at Oxbridge were being published before they could envision that the residents of a vast majority of those crap towns would vote to leave Europe to spite exactly the type of dickheads capable of conceiving such a book. Words like chav were bandied around. Black culture was broadly mocked by the heroin chic indie generation, which gave us ironic posh boy guitar covers of gangster rap anthems. Hip-hop was culturally appropriated across the board, to the point where the whole raison d'etre of YouTube rap battles seemed to be for educated white kids pretending to be street to own a black kid actually from the street with rhythmical insults. It was an era in which Noel Gallagher tried to prevent Jay-Z from playing at Glastonbury, but not Kylie Minogue or Fatboy Slim. Terms such as ghetto fabulous were being used, and there were trendy venues with names like favela chic. To express frustration at all this was to be rendered fringe radical, obsessed with playing the race card, because it was a period in which the notion of political blackness had waned, swallowed up by the cultural industries, something I wrote about in Afropean.
New York City, rain, preferable to the desert. It was simpler over there. Back home is more complicated. Not as complicated as our boys and girls in spandex would have you believe. More recon is required before you can shoot. Saw a kid arrested while on the run. Kid must have been 15 or 16. Junior would have been about that age now. Kept running. Wanted to get inside. About to go in when a cop car passed. Kid inside. Officer headed towards docks, not precinct. Had to follow. Hated when cops feel the need to become the monster. Unnecessary. My purpose, not theirs. Grabbed back by door. Followed on foot. Car stopped by warehouse. 2 men by door. Kid escorted inside by cop. Climbed shipping containers far enough away not to be seen. Used drone. Idiots had left the window open. Slipped drone in. Kid was in a cage with a dozen others. Guard shouted at them. "Shut up! Scum! I will kill you!" the rest not empty. Spotted guards dumping bodies into oil barrels. Liquid inside oil barrels dissolves bodies. Good method. Used it myself many times. Cop from earlier was the only one in uniform. Found out later the rest were off duty or retired. 8 guards, 10 with 2 at door, all armed. Retrieve drone, check gun, Colt, 1911. Classic. 7 rounds per mag, 2 mags sufficient. Excuse me, sir, you can't be here. Private property. Bent down to catch breath. 1 second, just passing through. One came closer. Sir, you really can't, drew gun. Dropped the big ones. Rain helped to muffle the sound. Only one came out. What the hell's going on? Dropped him too. They all heard that. Went round side. Used grapple hook to get up to open window. 3 were stacked up by the main door. 2 hid behind desk. 1 behind the oil barrel. He had been stuffing bodies into seconds earlier. The cop tried the back door. It was locked. I didn't waste time. 4 shots, 2 down. Reloaded. 5 shots, rest down. The cop was slippery. Went inside. Checked bodies for cage key. All had matching tattoos. Made pretty clear they were all fans of old Adolf's work. Found key. Open cage. Called Heroes for Hire. Made way home. Good run.
Hi Frank, thank you so much for your submission. As you know, all of us over at Vigilantes That Kill are massive fans of your work, so it was a real honour to receive a piece from you. So again, thank you. Unfortunately, in its current form, your piece is not quite right for us. We're simply not sure that it will be appropriate for our readers. You see, we've conducted numerous surveys of our subscribers over the years and have discovered that 78% of our most loyal readers are employed by the various regional and federal law enforcement agencies of our great nation. Because of this, we feel that a piece which compares you and them, they really do look up to you, to monsters might not send the right message. An excerpt featuring some of the less desirable elements of our brave police force has similar issues, especially in the current political climate. Everyone has some sort of racial bias anyway, am I right? As such, we would greatly appreciate it if you submitted a different excerpt from your war journal, one awesome title by the way, one that features bad guys who are, actually bad. Maybe some drug dealers or pimps, for example. I'm sure you've put down many of them over the years. We look forward to reading your next submission. Best wishes, Ted Cruz, Deputy Editor, Vigilantes That Kill. Hi Frank, we are minutes away from printing our second issue. Do you have that second submission for us? Because we need it, like yesterday. Best wishes, Ted Cruz, Deputy Editor, Vigilantes That Kill.